this is something my wife has pointed out too. She said, well, men are going to have to stand up for themselves. But here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. And the reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical. Right? Like if we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. Right. And so I don't think that men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think that they have to throw their hands up in it's not even disbelief. It's that there's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances, because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away, or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. You know, if you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. But I can't see any way. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, you know, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who is employing those tactics are forbidden to me. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, like, it seems to me that it isn't men that have to stand up and say enough of this, even though that is what they should do. It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity. And it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal.
Schopenhauer was very respectful of love, as one might be towards a hurricane or a tiger. He deeply resented the disruption caused to intelligent people by infatuations, or what we'd call crushes, but he refused to conceive of these as either disproportionate or accidental. In his eyes, love is connected to the most important underlying project of the will to life, and hence of all of our lives, having children. Why all this noise and fuss about love, he asked? Why all the urgency, uproar, anguish and exertion? Because the ultimate aim of all love affairs is actually more important than all other aims in anyone's life, and therefore it's quite worthy of the profound seriousness with which everyone pursues it. The romantic dominates life because, Schopenhauer wrote, what is decided by it is nothing less than the composition of the next generation, the existence and special constitution of the human race in times to come. Of course, we rarely think of future children when we're asking someone out on a date, but in Schopenhauer's view, this is simply because the intellect remains much excluded from the real resolutions and secret decisions of its own will. Why should such deception be necessary? Because for Schopenhauer, we would never reliably to reproduce unless we had first, quite literally, lost our minds. This was a man deeply opposed to the boredom, routine, expense, and sheer sacrifice of having children. Furthermore, Schopenhauer argued that most of the time, if our intellect were properly in charge of choosing who we could fall in love with, we would pick very different people to the ones we actually end up with. But we're ultimately driven to fall in love not with anyone we'll just get on with well, but with people whom the will to life recognizes as ideal partners for the project of producing what Schopenhauer bluntly called balanced children. All of us are a little bit unbalanced ourselves, he thought. We're a bit too masculine or too feminine, too tall or too short, too rational or too impulsive. If such imbalances were allowed to persist or were aggravated in the next generation, the human race would, within a short time, sink into oddity. The will to life must therefore push us towards people who can, on account of their compensating imbalances, cancel out our own issues. A large nose combined with a button nose promise a perfect nose. He argued that short people often fall in love with tall people and more feminine men with more assertive and masculine women. Unfortunately, this theory of balancing attraction led Schopenhauer to a very bleak conclusion, namely that a person who is highly suitable for producing a balanced child with is almost never, though we can't realize it at the time because we've been blindfolded by the will to life, very suitable for us. We should not be surprised, he wrote, by marriages between people who would never have been friends. Love casts itself on people who, apart from sex, would be hateful, contemptible, and even abhorrent to us. The will to life's ability to further its own ends rather than our happiness may, Schopenhauer implied, be sensed with particular clarity in that rather scary, lonely moment just after orgasm. He wrote, "Directly after copulation, the devil's laughter is heard."